Hello and welcome back. Congratulations on submitting your first assignment. I wanted to post this video to continue some of the discussions that we're having around sustainability and learning for sustainable development, etc. But also as a pause, a stopping point, a reflection as we shift from Module 1 to Module 2. So in this module, we'll be looking at the science of sustainability, flows, cycles, loops, and systems. The great physicist Fritjof Capra reminds us that the term sustainable has been overused and often misused, so that articulating clearly what we mean by the term is of utmost importance. Capra reminds us that to develop sustainable human communities, we do not have to start from square one. We have models. There have been human communities that have sustained themselves over generations. But Capra reminds us that the most powerful models we have are nature's ecosystems. The biosphere has an inherent ability to sustain life. Having a basic understanding of how ecosystems have organized themselves to sustain life over billions of years is important to being ecologically literate and fully grasping the fundamentals of what it means to sustain ourselves in cooperation with the environment around us. Science has a big role to play in facilitating this understanding and allowing people to truly grasp how we are embedded in an ecosystem and how we are a part of a web of life. So in this module, we will explore the science of sustainability and the basic principles of ecology. So I thought it would be a good idea to share some of my recent thinking and writing around the historical narratives found in environmental education, environmental learning, sustainable development education, etc. But also include some conceptual frameworks that have been used in recent research and literature on areas of sustainability and ecology. I hope this is helpful. So this video will briefly outline the history and theoretical genealogy, as Michel Foucault calls it, of learning for sustainable development by tracing its emergence in formal and informal educational contexts. Here I will outline how learning for sustainable development scholarship attributes its theoretical beginnings in ancient Greece, in the Boy Scout movement, and then in Outward Bound. These historical conceptions are still deeply rooted in learning for sustainable development research, theory, and practice, and interestingly continue to form lived experiences for scholars, educators, and learners. Scholars trace the foundations of experiential education and learning for sustainable development to Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato's work in ancient Greece. With respect to Plato and Socrates, Stonehouse and other authors sketch the influence of ancient Greek philosophy on modern approaches to learning for sustainable development. The authors consider that the Eletic or Socratic method is foundational to experiential education and by extension learning for sustainable development, whereby through a series of questions, a learner can determine what she should know and what she doesn't know yet. Within the Socratic method, a teacher would only facilitate learning with prompts to elicit future discoveries. On the other hand, Plato's influence on learning for sustainable development has resonance because of his efforts to fuse education and philosophy with physicality in order to actualize his holistic interpretation of harmony. It is through an analysis of Plato's work that terms like democracy and virtue are found, and these are two terms used in learning for sustainable development and education more broadly. Before continuing with things like democracy and virtue, I want to just note that I've opted not to fully review the history of environmental education and its appearance in U.S. curriculum in the 1960s, which surfaced after Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. To briefly summarize, Carson denotes how environmental issues in the 1960s were very concerned with DDT, and she raised awareness on the negative effects of DDT and how it was responsible for killing fish, birds, and other wildlife in Chesapeake Bay. So back to considering the conceptions of democracy and virtues, Aristotle argues for morals and ethics both in education and society. For Aristotle, knowledge produces morals and virtues, and through the development of morals and virtues, or lack thereof, known as vices, over a lifetime a person develops character. virtues can be understood through the processes of phronesis, or how reflection relates to experience in a cyclical method. This is comparable to what John Dewey calls a pattern of inquiry and how Freire describes praxis. In modern experiential education approaches to learning for sustainable development, the ancient Greek definitions of phronesis, morals, character, virtue are all pertinent to learning for sustainable development programs, as they often assert that character building takes place and is transferable to other educational or societal contexts. For example, building patience and resiliency through something like gardening might be transferable to resiliency and patience in mathematics. So these notions of transference, where skills developed in one context can then be applied to another, while foundational, are heavily critiqued. So I can point you to a scholar called Andrew Brooks, who really critiques the neo-Hanean aspect of outdoor learning. And by neo-Hanean, I'm referring to Kurt Hahn, who is the founder of Outward Bound. Taking a critical perspective on ancient Greek notions of character building, it is important to point out that Plato's idea of democracy was not open to all classes in Greek society. For example, women, children, laborers, foreigners, and slaves were not eligible for leadership. Therefore, Greek philosophy was only possible because of the material conditions and societal structure that was based on slavery and inequity. Aristotle declared women as passive, inferior, and governed by the forces of the earth due to their menstrual cycle. Class and gender exclusion was present in, and necessary to, the ancient Greek educational system. And I argue that these historical influences from ancient Greece, while still pertinent, need to be highly contextualized when employing their principles in relation to today's learning for sustainable development programming, as there is a risk of perpetuating and normalizing uncritical narratives. I'm going to move on to Boy Scouts and Outward Bound. Building on concepts like character building and morals from ancient Greek philosophy, more recent theoretical foundations of outdoor learning and learning for sustainable development are often traced to the Boy Scouts movement of the early 1900s and to the creation of Outward Bound in the 1940s. These initiatives are credited to Boy Scout founder Robert Baden-Powell and experiential educator Kurt Hahn. While the Boy Scouts and Outward Bound are entirely different organizations, there are similarities, as each organization share a corporate influence and an emphasis on hegemonic masculinity. In the Anglosphere, these two organizations dominate the foundational myths surrounding the origin of learning for sustainable development. Andrew Brooks states that analytically engaging with these myths and narratives can help explain and interpret current practice and rhetoric in today's learning for sustainable development structure. So the Boy Scouts were originally founded in the United Kingdom in response to British colonial issues in Africa. The Boy Scouts movement global expansion in the 1910s is attributed to its masculine values coupled with corporate America's support. Kimmel reminds us that economic change and the foreclosure of the fantasy of going west rendered the testing of manhood increasingly difficult by the beginning of the 20th century. As the frontier west had all but been discovered, society expressed concern about the younger generation, as many had moved into urban centers of North America. Burns calls attention to how youth programs, curriculum, teaching, and the institutional structure of schools are replete with gendered anxiety, and how this concern was further compounded as the majority of men in urban centers left the house for corporate work. Worried citizens turned to the Boy Scouts to combat the emasculation of boys who were raised by their mothers and taught by female teachers. Kimmel also notes how the influential psychologist and supporter of the Boy Scouts movement, G. Stanley Hall, warned against coeducation because he feared it would feminize boys when they needed to be working off their brute animal element. American Senator Albert Beveridge added, quote, "A young man is like a male animal after all, and those who object to his riding, like a young bull, are in perpetual quarrel with nature." At the time, Boy Scouts denounced modern society as producing effeminate sissies with flabby muscles and even flabbier character. The chronicles of Outward Bound were slightly different. However, and this is quite interesting, the most cited Learning for Sustainable Development article in the past 20 years is a meta-analysis on outward bound programming. This is an indication of the significant influence the organization has on the field of outdoor learning and learning for sustainable development. Before Outward Bound was created, Kurt Hahn and his associates were already involved in character training for young seamen. While there was a concern for young seamen and their ability to survive when stranded at sea during the Second World War, there are also accounts that Hahn was commissioned by the Blue Funnel shipping line to reduce the loss of lives from sinking ships. The first programs at Outward Bound were 4-week long and primarily focused on seamanship for young men. Amongst the many objectives of Outward Bound, one was to mix boys from different backgrounds. And while sailing was the main activity, trainees were required to partake in lifesaving and swimming, intense athletics, and a land-based expedition, and for some courses, participants had to demonstrate active citizenship and be helpful members of the community. The outdoor activities offered at Outward Bound intended to have outcomes beyond the technical skills. Vevers and Allison state that the aim was not to simply teach athletics, but to develop the individual through athletics. The same philosophy was applied to the sailing. Freeman states that sailing trainees not only trained for the sea, but trained through the sea. In the mountains, Outward Bound set up a character-building school based on mountaineering. So it's worthwhile to highlight that sailing has historically been considered a very privileged activity. A recent systematic review on sail training research indicated that the socioeconomic background of participants is not discussed in detail in any of the research, which I consider to be a major omission. The program structure at Outward Bound was designed to intentionally expose young men to challenging situations to strengthen their character. As the program progressed, the tasks would become progressively more difficult. This continuation approach to experiential education that was offered at Outward Bound can be compared to the experiential theories of John Dewey. Dewey describes the experiential continuum as a form of growth through experiences. Growth is not only a physical change, it is also intellectual and moral. This same development, which was through activities, was the anticipated outcome of Outward Bound. So in the early stages, Outward Bound's methods of delivering education and character training were not without critics. Brooks suggests that even in the early years at Outward Bound, the real message was not transferable to other learning situations. He argues that pupils attended the Center for Activities and that the symbolism and rhetoric appealed to the adults. Kurt Hahn and Outward Bound were often criticized by people inside and outside the movement. And the 3 areas under critique were: 1. The militaristic nature of Outward Bound; 2. The unconvinced long-term value of a 4-week course; and 3. The difficulty of measuring the impact of an Outward Bound course on the idea of character. This criticism in the 1940s is an indication of the skepticism of the claims regarding character training that Outward Bound was advocating a militaristic agenda and curriculum in learning for sustainable development. However, with an increase in gender awareness, hegemonic masculinity and its exclusionary effects have been the focus of a recent article on learning for sustainable development research. This was an article by Blenkinsop, Pearsall, and Derby. Further, other studies, like Simon Beams and Atencio, show that the shortcomings of Learning for Sustainable Development program do not incorporate knowledge of local patterns of community relationships with nature, and further critique the neo-Hahnian aspect of Learning for Sustainable Development and contend that someone's character cannot be changed during a week or month-long field studies course. Taken together, the criticism of these organizations resonate with the criticisms of Learning for Sustainable Development within the literature, as the field in general has been criticized for perpetuating a frontier-seeking, militaristic ethos, colonialism, whiteness, sexism, and other exclusionary processes. Despite and in spite of these ongoing condemnations, in its search for academic legitimacy while declaring its epistemic purposes in national curricula, Learning for Sustainable Development scholars have used different philosophical and conceptual frameworks for learning outdoors and in natural environments. Then this will be the subject of the following video.